That first hard lesson in manhood ended up shaping every part of my life that followed. By 16, I was standing on the edge of a choice that would define me. Either stay and let Derek completely own me, or push back and deal with whatever came next. I didn't realize it back then, but that moment of defiance was racing toward me faster than I could prepare for. It was going to tear me away from what little safety I still had, but at the same time, it would become the beginning of everything that came after. My breaking point showed up the summer I turned 16. School had just let out, and while everyone else my age was talking about summer jobs, lake trips, and freedom, my world looked nothing like theirs. Derek had already decided my path. He told me I'd be working full-time at his auto yard. To him, summer wasn't about rest or fun. It was prime business season, the time when the men worked under the blazing sun, stripping engines and welding frames until their shirts clung with sweat. One night at dinner, he looked across the table and said flatly, "Starting Monday, you're mine, from sunup to sundown." I tried to stand my ground the only way I knew how. "I still want to keep my hours at the corner store," I told him. "I'm saving up for school supplies, maybe college applications." He slammed his fist so hard the dishes rattled. "College? Don't make me laugh. You're not built for that. You'll either work real jobs or end up a worthless bum." My mom froze, eyes down, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. I wanted her to say something, to speak up for me, but I knew her fear of him always won out over her courage. The argument didn't stop that night. For days, Derek repeated his order every chance he got. "The yard opens at 6. You'll be there at 5:30, he'd bark. He left notes on the fridge, scribbled reminders of my duties. One afternoon, he even stormed into the corner store and told my boss I was wasting time stacking shelves. I knew what it meant to defy him. Still, something inside me refused to surrender. I couldn't let him crush the small piece of hope I was holding on to. The hope that my life could be something more than grease stains, shouting, and exhaustion. The final blow came on a sticky Thursday night. Cicadas screamed outside, and the air smelled like gasoline from Derek's clothes. I had just told him I wasn't quitting school, and I wasn't quitting the store. His face turned red. "You think you get to make choices? Not in my house. You either work for me, or you don't live here." My stomach twisted, but I stood firm. "Then I don't live here." His lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. He leaned in close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath and said, "You're not my blood. You're not my problem." Those words hit like a death sentence. My mother broke down crying, begging him to stop. But Derek just grabbed my backpack, shoved it against my chest, and pushed me toward the door. "Derek, please, he's just a boy," she cried, clinging to his arm. He shook her off without hesitation. I turned back to her one last time. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Noah. Please forgive me." I wanted to run back, to hold on and never let go, but the door slammed shut between us. Outside, the air was thick and humid. I stood there with nothing but a half-packed backpack and the locket my mom had given me years before. That was the night my childhood ended. I spent my first night under the old railroad bridge on the edge of town. The ground was cold and damp, and every passing car made me flinch. Hunger clawed at my stomach, but the loneliness cut deeper than anything else. I kept hearing Derek's words in my head. "You're not my blood, you're not my problem," and each time, they hit harder. If my own mother couldn't protect me, who would? The next few weeks blurred into one long test of survival. I learned where the grocery store tossed out expired bread, which gas station clerk would slip me a sandwich if I swept the lot, and which churches left their doors unlocked so I could rest in the back pew for a few hours. I kept working at the corner store as long as I could, but without an address, people started noticing. Wrinkled clothes, tired eyes. Eventually the owner pulled me aside and said, "Noah, you can't keep showing up like this. Customers talk." He handed me my last paycheck, and I walked out with nowhere to go. Nights were spent among other kids the world had thrown away, runaways, kids with addicted parents, or those who'd simply run out of places to turn. We shared scraps of food and broken stories about the people who'd failed us. One boy said his dad kicked him out for stealing. A girl told me her stepmother locked her out one night and never let her back in. Listening to them, I realized I wasn't alone in my pain, though that didn't make it any easier to bear. Every day became a fight, for food, for safety, for the strength to keep going. The voice in my head whispered that I was worthless, but I carried my mother's locket in my pocket and held it whenever that darkness crept too close. If she couldn't save me, then I'd save myself by surviving one more day. The bitterness toward my real father burned hotter with each passing night. Why hadn't he been there? Why had he left me to a man who hated me? Those questions turned into fuel, feeding the fire that kept me alive. By 16, I was living under bridges and behind dumpsters, but I refused to break. I had no idea that this was just the beginning, or that the truth about who my father really was had been waiting for me all along. By the time I hit 30, I'd lived more lives than I ever thought possible for a kid from Ohio. The years between 16 and 30 hardened me, sure, but they also taught me how to survive in a world that didn't care if I disappeared. I drifted from town to town, sometimes hitchhiking, sometimes walking, always chasing the next bit of steady work. I picked crops during harvests, cleaned cheap motel rooms, and spent whole months collecting bottles just to cash them in for change. There were winters when I thought I'd never make it. The cold would creep so deep into my bones that I'd forget what warmth even felt like. Stability was something I never managed to hold on to. The closest I ever came was a dishwashing job at a small diner in Kentucky, a squat brick building off a quiet county road. It was the kind of place truckers stopped at before sunrise for coffee and eggs, and families crowded into after church on Sundays. I worked in the back, surrounded by towers of dirty plates and the constant hiss of hot water. The smell of soap and grease clung to me no matter how many showers I took. The pay barely covered the rent for a tiny room above a hardware store, but to me, it was still more than I'd had in years. There was comfort in that routine, strange as it sounds. Every morning, I clocked in at 6, worked until the dinner rush faded, and dragged my aching body home. My hands were cracked from scrubbing dishes, my back stiff from standing all day, but at least I wasn't sleeping under bridges anymore. I had a bed, for walls, and enough food to quiet the hunger that had once gnawed at me as a teenager. Still, deep inside, I felt like a ghost. People passed me by without a glance. The only words I heard were quick ones from the waitresses when they dropped off trays of dirty dishes. Then, one cold autumn evening, everything changed. I was elbow-deep in soapy water when the bell over the diner door jingled. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I heard something that made me freeze. "Excuse me, is there a Noah Carter who works here?" The voice was steady, authoritative. My name. Nobody ever asked for me. Outside of my manager, nobody even knew my full name. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped out from the kitchen. A man in his 50s stood near the counter. He was tall, with graying hair combed neatly back and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His coat was dark, and under one arm he held a leather folder. "That's me," I said carefully. "I'm Noah." He gave a small, deliberate nod. "My name is Lucas Merritt. I've been looking for you for 14 years. The diner went dead silent. The waitresses glanced at one another. A customer set down his coffee and just stared. My chest tightened. Nobody searched for people like me. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaky. Lucas reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Thick, sealed, and handled with care. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward me. "Your father left instructions," he said quietly. "He wanted you found, no matter how long it took." The world tilted under my feet. I grabbed the counter just to stay upright. "My father," I repeated, the words barely leaving my mouth. "I don't even know who he was." Lucas's expression softened. "That's about to change." I stared at the envelope, frozen. For years, I'd cursed the man who'd abandoned me, imagined him as a coward who'd left my mother and me to struggle alone. I pictured him as a ghost who didn't care whether I lived or died. And now, here was this stranger standing in front of me, saying my father had left something behind. My emotions tangled. Fear, anger, disbelief. Part of me wanted to tear the envelope open right there. Another part wanted to throw it in the trash and walk away. I'd made it 30 years without him. Why should I start caring now? But curiosity won. It always does. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The envelope felt heavier than it looked. "Why now?" I asked. "Why after all this time?" Lucas's reply was calm but cryptic. Because he knew timing mattered. He knew the truth would only make sense after you'd lived enough to understand it. I didn't know what that meant, but the words stuck in my head like smoke you can't wave away. I looked down at the envelope again, my name written neatly across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Not my mother's. Not mine. But it felt meant for me. I tucked it under my arm, unable to open it in front of strangers. My mind raced as I walked back to my small rented room. Questions I'd buried for years came rushing back. Who was my father really? Why did he stay away? What could possibly be in this envelope that was worth 14 years of searching? That night, I sat at my rickety table with the envelope in front of me. I just stared at it for hours. I was afraid to open it, because I knew once I did, nothing would be the same. The life I'd built, the anger I'd carried, even the identity I'd worn like armor, it would all change the second I read what was inside. Finally, I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. My hands were shaking so bad I had to brace the envelope against the table. Inside was a thick stack of papers. The first page was a bank statement. My eyes skimmed the numbers without really processing them, until one number caught my attention. $73 million. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The number didn't change. My throat tightened. For a moment, I was sure it had to be a mistake. How could a man who had abandoned me, who had left me to the mercy of a cruel stepfather, leave behind that kind of money? And why would it have my name on it? Under the statement was a letter, handwritten, the paper yellowed around the edges. My name sat at the top in bold strokes. Noah, it began. I took a breath and read. My son, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I have no way of knowing what kind of man you've become, but I've carried you in my heart every day of my life. If these words have reached you, then the time has come for you to know the truth. I pressed the page to my chest. For the first time in my life, I was reading the voice of the man who had given me life. When you were born, I was already living in danger. My name is Richard Langford. I built a business that grew fast, too fast, and with that success came enemies. When your mother became pregnant, the threat started. People I trusted turned against me. I realized that anyone close to me was in danger. To protect you, I made the hardest decision of my life. I disappeared. I gave your mother everything she needed to keep you safe, but I couldn't stay without putting both of you at risk. My chest tightened as the words sank in. For years, I told myself my father was a coward, but now, I wasn't so sure. Now I understood. My father hadn't disappeared because he didn't care. He'd left because he was afraid for my life. Every word of the letter seemed to grow heavier as I read. I arranged for money to be placed aside, held in trust to give you the future I couldn't provide myself, he had written. I asked a man I trusted, Lucas Merritt, to find you when the time was right. If you are reading this, it means I'm gone, but I hope you now understand why I had to stay hidden. Tears blurred the ink. I wiped them away, refusing to stop reading. I never stopped loving you, Noah. Every day, I thought of you. Every decision I made was for your safety. I regret that you had to grow up without me, but I pray that one day you'll see I acted out of love. You were not abandoned. You were protected. I set the letter down and buried my face in my hands. My entire life, I had carried the belief that I was unwanted, a burden too heavy for anyone to bear. And now, here I was, holding proof that my father had loved me so fiercely he gave up everything to keep me safe. The fortune, $73 million, barely registered compared to those words. The number was unimaginable, but the line that echoed in my mind was simple and powerful. You were not abandoned. You were protected. I thought of the old locket tucked away in my backpack, the one I had carried like a relic of a ghost. It was never a piece of my father. It was a piece of my mother's love, a love that had been trapped, silent, afraid. Now, somehow, both of their loves, hers tender and fragile, his distant but steadfast, had finally found their place together inside me. For the first time since I was a boy, I cried freely. Every night I'd spent under bridges, every hunger pang, every ounce of anger I'd carried toward a man I thought had abandoned me, it all poured out of me in waves. My chest ached, but in that ache, there was release. Hours passed before the tears slowed. I read the letter again, then again, each time feeling the words carve new meaning into my heart, reshaping everything I thought I knew about myself. While Derek had cast me aside and my mother had been too afraid to fight for me, my real father had been loving me quietly from the shadows. I thought of Lucas standing in that diner, calm, patient, steady, as he told me he'd been searching for me for 14 years. I understood now the weight he must have carried all that time. Richard Langford had trusted him with the most sacred task a man could give, to deliver the truth to his son when the world was finally safe enough to hear it. I glanced back at the bank statement. $73 million. The number looked almost unreal, like it belonged to someone else's story. I thought about the 16-year-old kid I used to be, shivering under a bridge, clutching a locket, wondering if life would ever get better. I thought of the hunger, the cold, the endless jobs taken just to stay alive. And now, somehow, that same boy stood on the other side of it all, facing a fortune he could barely comprehend. It would have been easy to say I felt joy, but the truth was far more complicated. I felt grief for the years that had been stolen, anger at my mother for never telling me the truth, confusion about what this money was supposed to mean. But underneath all of that, buried deep and glowing faintly, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. My father's letter had given me back something I didn't even know I'd lost: my name. Not boy, not burden, not mistake. I was Noah Carter, son of Richard Langford, a man who had traded presents for protection, a man whose love had reached across decades to find me. That night, I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and whispered into the stillness of my room. I forgive you, Father. Thank you for never forgetting me. For hours afterward, I just sat there in silence. The money was overwhelming, but what truly weighed on me was the knowledge that I hadn't been abandoned after all. For years, I'd lived inside a story that painted me as unwanted, forgotten, disposable. That belief had shaped everything: how I saw the world and how I saw myself. But now, in my hands, was proof that my father's absence had been an act of love, not rejection. The next few days felt unreal, like I was living someone else's life. Lucas Merritt stayed in town, meeting me privately to explain how my father's estate had been managed. He spoke in calm, measured tones, patient and precise, making sure I understood the responsibility that came with wealth like this. Your father wanted you to have freedom, Lucas told me, but he also wanted you to be wise. He knew that the years you spent surviving would give you perspective, something money can't buy. I nodded, though it was hard to wrap my mind around it all. I kept thinking of the years I'd spent digging through trash bins for food, sleeping under bridges, begging strangers for spare change. Years when I believed I was worthless. And now, here was a man telling me I had enough to never struggle again. But the more I sat with it, the clearer it became. The money wasn't the real gift, it was the lesson. The proof that survival, endurance, and love come in forms we don't always recognize. My father's love had been distant but unbreakable. My mother's love had been fragile but genuine. And even the faint, battered love I'd carried for myself, all of it had kept me alive long enough to reach this moment. The first thing I did was visit my mother. For years, I'd avoided her, carrying the anger of that night when Derek threw me out, and she said nothing. When I stepped into her small apartment, she gasped like she'd seen a ghost. Her hair had turned gray, her hands trembling as she reached for me. "Noah," she whispered. "I thought I lost you forever." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You never lost me, Mom," I said quietly. "I just needed to understand why." That was all it took. She broke down, sobbing, apologizing over and over. "After Derek left, I was so ashamed," she said through her tears. "I looked for you, but after a year, then two, I thought you were better off without the mother who failed you. I didn't think I deserved to find you." I took her hands and told her I forgave her. Then I told her about the letter, about my father, about the truth. Her eyes filled with both sorrow and relief. And for the first time since I was a child, I felt like her son again. Forgiving her didn't erase the past, but it set me free. Still, I knew I couldn't stop there. I thought about all the kids I'd met on the streets, the ones who shared scraps of food with me, who vanished overnight, swallowed by a world that pretended they didn't exist. I thought of my 16-year-old self, shivering in the cold, wondering if life would ever get better. I couldn't change my past, but maybe I could change someone else's future. So I used part of my inheritance to start a foundation for homeless youth. We built shelters with warm beds and hot meals. We offered counseling, job training, and, most importantly, a chance to be seen. I visited often, sitting beside the kids, listening to their stories. Some of them didn't believe me when I told them I had once been where they were. "You don't look like it now," one boy said. I smiled. "Neither will you one day. Keep fighting. You are not forgotten." Every time I walked out of one of those shelters, I carried a feeling no amount of money could buy. My father had left me wealth, but what he truly gave me was purpose. the chance to turn my pain into something good. I didn't stop working either, though not as a dishwasher anymore. I began speaking at schools, churches, and community centers, telling my story so people could understand what it really means to lose everything and still keep going. People listened because they could tell I wasn't reciting a speech. I was reliving something real. Every word came from somewhere deep and scarred, but still standing. Now, when I think back to that boy, standing outside his home with a backpack and nowhere to go, I wish I could tell him what I know now. I'd tell him, hold on. The pain is real, but it won't last forever. You are stronger than you think. Your life has meaning, even if you can't see it yet. The night my stepfather threw me out, I thought my story was ending. But the truth is, it was just beginning. What I learned is simple but powerful. Sometimes we are broken so we can be rebuilt stronger. Sometimes we are cast aside so we can learn how to stand alone. And sometimes we are hidden, not because we're forgotten, but because the world isn't ready for who we're meant to become. I don't carry anger anymore. I carry gratitude. Gratitude for my father's sacrifice, for my mother's fragile love, for Lucas's loyalty, and for my own refusal to give up. And to you, listening to my story now, I want to leave you with this. No matter how forgotten you feel, no matter how cruel the world has been, you are not worthless. You are not beyond hope. Your story is not finished. Thank you for staying with me through mine. If this story touched you, please give the video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment about your own journey, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories of struggle, survival, and hope. Because every story like this reminds someone out there, they're not alone.